Hello and welcome to another SMI working group, multi-cluster working group meeting. In case you haven't put down your name yet, please do. As usual, recorded. And I guess we have some progress reports there. I hope. Let's see.
Should we take it away with the progress report? Let's do it. Hi friends, my name is Dalian. So over the past couple of weeks, a few of us have been working on kind of the next stages of multi-cluster SMI doc. I'm going to share that with you maybe in chat so we have it. Thanks to all of those who helped, Sergio, Johnson. Yesterday we had some lots of fun kind of working on this doc. And I should say where the doc is, I believe we have a good set of, speaking of Sergio, hi, we have a good set of user stories now, trying to look at what are those kind of user-facing problems that we're trying to solve by potentially augmenting multi-cluster SMI with multi-cluster primitives. Maybe, what if I share the doc and walk you through it? Would that be beneficial? All right, we're gonna.
Yes, please.
We are gonna do exactly that.
Can you share the screen? Are you?
I believe so. There we go.
Yes. Perfect.
Hopefully you see it. All right, let me walk you through it. So summary, what we're trying to do here with this doc. So we recognize that current version of SMI spec has kind of a few CRDs, a few primitives that can only reference either services or service accounts in only one Kubernetes cluster. Well, we would like to change that. So we want to tweak that. This is kind of what this problem statement states. I'm gonna spend too much time because we know why we're here in this meeting, what we're working on, but essentially for new folks, 2-second kind of problem statement is SMI spec is comprised of traffic target, traffic split, traffic metrics, HTTP route, TCP route, UDP route. Now, two of those, traffic target and traffic split, are the ones that reference kind of Kubernetes primitives.
Like been said before, this is a race between the vaccines and the virus.
Can we mute Nick Jackson? All right, and so for traffic target specifically, we have mentions in it of Kubernetes service accounts. So if we want to evolve SMI spec to reference more than one clusters, obviously just using a Kubernetes service account, which is focused on one cluster, is not going to work. Similar for traffic split, we have a mention of Kubernetes service and splitting that to 2 other services. It's not sufficient. We can't necessarily reference other Kubernetes clusters or other heterogeneous payload. I should mention that we kind of expanded the scope of this group and also this doc to not only talk about a second or third Kubernetes cluster, but also other heterogeneous payloads. Feel free to interrupt me with questions. So I just breezed through kind of like what problem we have and what we're trying to solve. All right, let's focus on the user stories. So what are those user-focused problems that we're trying to solve? And so as I'm walking you through kind of those 4 high-level scenarios, thank you, Sergio, so much for helping kind of synthesize those. I want you to kind of notice how they're actually very similar. It all looks like the same problem, looking at it from a slightly different angle. All right, we're starting with the scale. And so we're always talking about east-west traffic pattern. We want to be specific about that. In almost each point, we're talking about east-west because we believe that north-south, when you actually have some sort of ingress out from the internet to multiple clusters, that's already kind of addressable today. Each cluster can function separately. You have some sort of ingress that can load balance between 2 clusters. We're not trying to address that. We're trying to focus sharply on east-west communication between services on the same cluster, now multiple clusters between the services. All right. First user story is as an operator, I want to scale out my service. So I'm within the same admin domain. I want to, if you think of it, add capacity to my service. So one cluster is not enough. I'm going to be adding more deployments onto another cluster to add capacity to the service. And with that, there's of course a few nuances. We want to make sure that we have guarantees where traffic sometimes may need to remain in the cluster. So we need to kind of have a notion of locality or latency of certain endpoints, specifically for endpoints that are further away. We want to be able to tweak SMI so that it accommodates for awareness of the cost of getting to the next endpoint and prioritize local endpoints of the destination service. I hope that use case is clear. By the way, the synthesis of those 4 points are based off of kind of more verbose kind of user scenarios that we now put in a graveyard because we don't think that's necessary anymore. So we scroll to the bottom. This is what this graveyard is. Now deprecated cases, but they're all synthesized off of kind of this more verbose text. All right, so we spoke about scale. I think scale is pretty clear. The second use case here is the high availability or disaster recovery. Again, this is east-west. So again, while scale is about capacity, adding more compute to some service, now a high availability or disaster recovery, just making sure that we have replica of some, let's call it service or deployment in another cluster, so that if something happens to the first cluster, then the second and the third provides you with that kind of redundancy. As kind of this example states, one cluster is in one environment, some service fails, well, then we can start redirecting the traffic to some other cluster. So now for this, unlike scale, we need to start thinking about a bit more complex kind of health and failure events. While for scale, we believe that it's a bit more kind of trivial or simpler. For high availability or disaster recovery, we need to have some sort of triggers, which will indicate when you start routing traffic to the second kind of DR cluster or heterogeneous payload. And that could be, CPU, GPU, latency, unavailability of endpoints. Again, we're still assuming east-west and same admin domain. And now getting into something even more interesting, third point here is migration. That's another kind of user scenario. So again, for all of those, we have an application which is pre-deployed on all clusters. SMI is not going to be necessarily concerned with figuring out when to deploy or how to deploy. We assume that this application, those services exist on, let's say, the 2 clusters. So now we want to migrate. We have some sort of a older cluster. We want to migrate this app to a new cluster. This is another kind of use case of the multi-cluster SMI. This looks very similar to traffic split, except of course it's now across multiple clusters migrating the traffic. And then we have kind of a bucket of multi-cloud app patterns. In this section, kind of we have a few specific scenarios of oftentimes you may have some app that is split between multiple services, between multiple clusters, but you might need some sort of a even stronger guarantees of where traffic should land. So for instance, if we wanted to do some sort of A/B test, then we would need to understand how to route traffic A, B to the right cluster. So then perhaps based on some header rule, we need to route traffic to a particular cluster. So then we need to understand how to do that and have the context to do that. How do we target traffic to a specific cluster? Furthermore, we know that we have certain requirements around stateful sets. It gets a bit more nuanced here, but how do we actually also provide the ability to target specific pods within a stateful set in this multi-cluster environment. This is kind of like outlining those particular scenarios that we've seen in industry, and we wanted to call them out as something to think about. All right, so this is the quick 12-minute, 13-minute overview of the use cases that we've added so far, and what we're aiming to solve with kind of the next stages of the proposal. Any questions? I know I breezed through this really quickly. Sergio, what did I miss? Sergio is...
Nothing, my friend.
All right. Any questions? I'm super happy to dig deeper and provide more detail. I know I breezed through at a very high level over use cases. Again, we're talking about scale, HA, disaster recovery, migration, and then kind of a few multi-cloud, multi-cluster traffic patterns with advanced routing.
And yes, they so I joined a few minutes late, so sorry if Del already said it, but we have intentionally left aside the heterogeneous infra use cases to focus this first on this, and then we'll shift to the other use cases and see if there is any intersection between them, or if it is a different set, or if interests in the community are different. We'll see, still work in progress.
I think this doc is really great, so thanks y'all for working on it. I was reviewing it before this meeting, and I just found it very helpful to like lay out the user scenarios. I'd be really interested in if anybody has like scenarios that aren't addressed and that need to be addressed in this doc. So maybe we could leave it open for comment. And then in terms of like, you know, there's definitely limitations in the current APIs that y'all highlighted. Would it make sense to kind of talk through what the potential solutions look like, potential future APIs look like, or does it make more sense to kind of just focus on the user stories for now?
Maybe I want to chime in here right away because I have certain level of guilt for like leaving this this here. I shouldn't have. You just kind of like left a bunch of SMI primitives there to have a conversation piece, but there's really no proposal yet on how to mutate them. I think in the past few meetings, all of us here agreed that we're going to focus on the user stories first and then think really hard about how to augment SMI. So I don't think that we're ready to talk about changing the SMI spec. Michael, Sergio, would you agree with that? Might be a little too early, or no?
I mean, I think first we need to get some feedback, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I think that's a really good point. Sorry. Yeah. I was just thinking about what would be a great way to really, you know, get the word out there. And maybe if we have an opportunity to do one of those webinars, whatever it is, what they're called, where you can essentially, you know, give an update and say like, look, you know, this is what we are doing. Many other like SIGs and so on, they present a certain, you know, implementation or whatever. And in our case, we would just, you know, essentially do what we just did, and maybe having a slide deck first saying like, okay, this is the motivation and here's where we are, etc. But the goal would be to essentially get the word out there and gather a little bit more feedback from end users and so on, and making a little bit noise, and, you know, have it in a structured way where people out there can, you know, and then, you know, we would do that, announce it a couple of weeks earlier so that, you know, everyone knows about it, and then attract a little bit of attention throughout the CNCF ecosystem. At least that was what I had in mind, because that's probably the next step that we need to do anyways, right?
Deadline, Bridget. I mean, depends on when the deadline for this is, right? So do we have a roadmap, or on the SMI community, so we have a deadline or we don't have a deadline, and it's all good. I mean, I'm not asking for a
that's my
deadline by any
question.
means.
Yeah. No,
we
my
we
question
already
is
have
just,
enough deadlines.
yeah, my question is, I love the idea of getting more input from the community. And usually if you time box requests like that, you get, people will make the decision whether or not they're going to participate. And if we have specific things we're trying to line up, like, you know, webinars or SIG presentations, anything like that, it's easier to work on something like that if we have an idea of approximately when do we want to do that. And Michelle mentions leaving it open for a week, and I think, well, that sounds great. You know, a week from today, we have our very next, you know, community call. But yeah, what do you think, Michelle, in terms of like how much time and input and, you know, PR push and whatnot do we need during this phase?
I think 1 to 2 weeks is nice. Like, I think what the feedback should be centered around is, you know, do these user stories encompass, like Sergio and Delian and Johnson have done a great job of compiling these user stories. So let's go ahead and leave it open for 1 to 2 weeks. Let's ask end users, let's ask the community, let's do some more due diligence around these scenarios. And then we can use the next meeting to address any comments and concerns, add things, or subtract whatever needs to be done, and then kind of start talking about potential solutions, if that works for everyone else. Delian?
Yeah, and maybe we also need to, in parallel, we will also need to add the other use cases as well, or I mean, continue iterating on this. But yeah, I think that's what you said, Michelle, sounds good to me. I don't know if 2 weeks is enough or not. I don't know that well the community dynamics. Is 2 weeks enough to have enough comments from others?
Yeah, I don't think so, because I've noticed that not everyone you know, is able to join the call. You know, like some people only show up once a month.
So 2 calls then maybe. I like Michelle's idea of time boxing this down to something that isn't a vast sweeping span of time out into the future, but maybe, you know, 2 of this call from now, so a month.
Yeah, I think that's good. You know, 2 calls. Yeah, first call, and then 2 weeks from now, another call. That should capture 80–90% of people who are interested.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then we could use the next call to just, you know, continue iterating on the doc, like Sergio mentioned.
Sounds great. I think that concludes my presentation or the current status update. So I'm going to hand it off to Michael.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's really you know, super impressive how far we got, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Is there anything else from anyone else on the call to comment on either the content or the, you know, next steps, the future, what we plan to do with it?
You know, since we have a few minutes, I'll just jump in. I saw that the limitations on traffic access and split were written down, and I just added a comment around the limitations in terms of traffic metrics, because we will need to figure out like a metrics scenario that spans multiple clusters. So just one highlight. And I was just wondering, had y'all talk about metrics at all, or do we feel like that's in scope or out of scope?
I think that should be in scope, right? Because since you know, we will be looking at you know, all of the communication across, you know, from cluster 1 to cluster 2 is east-west. There's no north-south. So the metrics should not be, you know, the metrics in cluster 1, cluster 2 should not be separate, but in fact should be aggregated as one. I mean, if it's of the same type, because it's east-west, not north-south.
Yeah, absolutely supportive. I would think that metrics, observability in general should be part of the story. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Maybe we could encompass metrics as part of the like one of the user stories, so we know that it's in scope and can be tackled. And I guess migration is a good story, doing progressive delivery type scenarios across multiple clusters using traffic metrics would be a good like starting point for talking about how we need to change traffic metrics to support multi-cluster scenarios.
That's a very interesting observation, Michelle. I agree. We need to look at traffic metrics kind of deeper. I wonder if this would be as simple as kind of scoping metrics within a cluster. Probably not. Probably there's a little more work there to be done. That's a good point. We need to dig into it.
Yeah, it's like definitely a more intricate vertical to think about. Very, very different from how we need to think about access and split.
I also had a comment on the doc, and I remember seeing this in an earlier version, but is there any scoping down around the trust situation, multi-CA, single CA, things like that?
No, we have to do that. Yeah, but you know, unless we want to have some identity federation mechanism, and for that we only, as far as I know, we only have the option of using Spire with that. I mean, the only ones who have an implementation for it as of now. The only other option is to have a common CA. But given that what we're discussing for the multi-cluster scenarios are a single administrative domain, it would make sense to have a common root CA for all of the clusters, right? The moment we jump into multiple administrative domains, maybe it doesn't make sense for all of the scenarios, right? But that's a good point. Do you have any insights on that, Keith?
No, what you were saying makes perfect sense. And just reading the document, it sounded like we were focusing on a single authoritative CA. Just didn't know, you know, if it was in scope one to get the clarification.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how prescriptive we should be there in terms of, you know, stating requirements versus how you meet these requirements. Meaning, like the one thing that kind of like when you said, Sergio, when you said, oh, we only have the option to use Spire there, right? This kind of like, well, like I'm supportive regarding Spire, don't get me wrong, but it means like, you know, there are many ways how you can go about certain things in terms of, you know, identity, authentication, etc., etc. And I think the last thing we want to do is being overly prescriptive or like, you know, saying like, this is the only way how you can do things, right? Versus where we say, okay, here are certain requirements that the one or other thing out there might fulfill. And for example, this can be done with Spire, Spiffy Spire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was, yes. So maybe I misspelled what I was trying to say, but it was exactly that.
No, as long as we're on the same page, I just want to avoid that we are like overly specific. Like, this is the only way how things can be done. Like, if you don't do Spiffy Spire, you know, you're out.
Fully agree. Yeah, maybe we don't need. Also, maybe we don't even need to be that explicit in terms of trust, right? What we can say is that in these kind of scenarios that we have been discussing, single root of trust is what we have seen that makes more sense. But, you know, there is always the option of doing multiple CAs if the underlying identity provider is able to do it. Right? We shouldn't impose any constraints, as you said.
Exactly. And I guess it very much depends on the environment, right? If you have something on premises or you're in a certain cloud provider, etc., there's different capabilities and different, you know, cost implications, etc., etc. And, you know, like if we are clear regarding requirements, and like as long as you have something that fulfills these requirements, and of course I'm all super supportive to say, you know, here is an example CNCF project that, you know, allows you to do X, Y, Z, and this is, you know, if we can show people how to use that, that's great. Yeah, but I guess we're all on the same page. I just wanted to make sure that
makes sense.
Clear on that.
That's a good challenge, Keith. I really appreciate Keith jumping into the doc and giving us lots of comments and finding
Awesome.
things that we've been ironing out. I love this conversation because I think there's we can do a bit more abstracting. I think that was covered as well. But I mean, we have identity, and then we have CA, and I don't know the SMI necessarily should be prescriptive or care too much about how the trust is set up or who issues the identities. Much like we reference some service and we reference some service account, SMI could reference something which then is set up by some other system, if that makes sense. It doesn't have to be necessarily setting up the trust itself. Maybe we should design that when time comes. Might be too early for that, but it's exciting to think about.
I can pull in Spire folks if needed as well. I can invite them to join us when we have that discussion as well, because
incredible.
Some of them are in VMware, so I have a good relationship with them.
Oh, hey, awesome. Thank you, Sergio.
Of course.
In fact, I wonder if it's misleading to have kind of like some spiffy mentions in the current doc. There's like, a bunch of explorations. Maybe I should somehow either remove that and just keep it at use cases from the current doc, or push it to the graveyard, not to lead people reading the doc to believe that we're starting to make decisions on the design. I might just curate that and just clean it up.
Ooh. All right. And with that, thanks a lot for the time check and for all your input. Awesome discussions. And we see us next week in the regular SMI meeting versus the very irregular every other week. Thank you so much. Have a great one. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.